you everyone for joining me this afternoon. Uh, just for those of you who haven't been to any of today's sessions, you may be wondering, who is this person? I'm Dr. Bethany Jacobs. I am the adoption consultant for your course evaluations product, which is run by a company called Anthology. You may have known the company as Campus Labs. We recently joined with two other education technology companies to form a new company called Anthology. This doesn't affect you in any way. Your experience of the course evaluation tool isn't changing. Over time, you'll see that Campus Labs logo fade out and be replaced by the Anthology logo. But other than that, you're not going to see any difference. So what do I do? Well, so I help campuses to improve teaching and learning through course evaluations. I come to this position after having been a faculty member for 10 years. I got a PhD at the University of Oregon. I was a faculty member at the University of Oregon and at Georgia Institute of Technology. So I'm familiar with course evaluations as a faculty member who got them for years and agonized over them and celebrated and wept over them. And then I also am familiar with course evaluations from an administrative standpoint because other roles that I had on campus was faculty development, working with campuses and working with individual faculty to improve teaching and learning. And those positions led me to my current position as a consultant with Anthology. So that's a little bit about my background, just so that you know where I'm coming from. As we head into today's discussion, a couple of things. I'm going to be doing this PowerPoint presentation, but I want you to feel free to ask questions. You can use the chat function to ask questions, or you can raise your hand on the Microsoft application to say, hey, I have a question. I will say that as we go through this, I'm going to be asking you to log into your course evaluation site. We're going through the training and something doesn't look right on your site, or you're confused about accessing something on your site, I'd ask you to hold those questions just because we don't really have time to troubleshoot individual experiences of the site today. But you can certainly follow up with your course evaluations administrator on campus, who's Peter Crosby. So just sort of laying out what we're doing today. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off for now so that we can just focus on the presentation. You're welcome to leave your camera on or turn it off or what have you. I do ask that you remain muted so that we don't have too much feedback. And let's just go ahead and get. So what are we going to talk about today? In some ways, this is going to be a basic training on how to use the site, something that I refer to as the point and click. How do you navigate through your site? How do you get to the different parts of your course evaluation experience? We're also going to be talking about filling out your objective selection form and how you make determinations in terms of what selections you want to make. But sort of weaving through this whole conversation is going to be this bigger issue. How do we use this tool to stay connected with our students and build a culture of assessment in the classroom? We're in a particularly unique time. Many of us are experiencing anxiety for personal reasons, but also for the professional reasons of, how has COVID-19 impacted teaching? Are my students still learning? I've had to completely redesign the way that I teach. Do I know how to do this? There's all of these concerns surrounding, whether or not we've moved back into the classroom or we're in a synchronous classroom or a hybrid classroom. We're still learning how to do this, and we're still not sure how much longer we'll be doing this. And so a big thing I want us to think about today is how do we use this tool to get through some of the anxieties we have about staying connected with students. If you're like me as a faculty member, I really depended on that face-to-face time to connect with students, and not being in the classroom with them can make us feel like we don't have that connection that's so necessary to teaching. So as we go through this training, there's some things I want us to think about. So first off, there's this question that a lot of people have been asking, which is, has the quality of education decreased this year? Am I any less of a teacher? Are my students achieving learning less than they were before? So here's the interesting thing. We've actually done a study on this. We've looked at the difference between the data that was gathered in spring 2020 versus spring 2019. And contrary to what some might have expected, there hasn't been a noticeable difference in any of the measures or any of the data that the IDEA tools measure. So for one, many people thought that participation would plummet. Not dramatically or not particularly noticeably has participation in course evaluations gone down. Similarly, we found no meaningful difference in the quality of teaching, the quality of the course, or students' self-reported progress on learning objectives. Lots of people expected this to be a sort of bloodbath. Our research has shown that it was not a bloodbath, that students are still learning, that teaching is still effective. Now, that said, we're still contending with this anxiety, and the anxiety is real, and our individual experiences of how the classroom have changed are legitimate, both for us and for our students. So part of what we need to think about today is, given these circumstances, what can we learn now that will be relevant to us in 2 years, 3 years, or whenever it is we get back to this quote unquote normal that we're imagining of how the teaching environment should be, which frankly, we don't know what normal will be, even next term versus, in another year. But what we do know is that we can learn from this moment. We can learn things that will help us, not just in the midst of COVID, but in the future. So as we talk through the site and talk through these things today, I just want these to be some things that you keep in the back of your mind to add some context to the conversation that we're having. So something that I would ask is, since you're at your computer, hopefully, go ahead and log into your course evaluation site. The link is just usu.campuslabs.com/faculty. You can log in using your normal US State credentials. I just find that it can be useful to be on your site yourself as we are going through this material. So let me just give everybody a moment to go ahead and log into that. I just want to point out that I see a number of people with their hands raised in the Microsoft Teams function. I just want to make sure there's nobody who has a question that's waiting for me to call on them. If you still have a question, feel free to speak up now. I see hands disappearing, so I'm guessing that we just left our hands up. Okay, since we're logged in, let's go ahead. Once you log in, what you should see is a home page that looks something like this. As a caveat, the page that you're looking at now, this is taken from a account that we use for training purposes. So as you can imagine, Sample Instructor is not actually the first and last name of a real instructor, though that would be hilarious. The data that you're going to see as we look through this test account, some of it you'll look at it and be like, gosh, I've never heard of a faculty member who's teaching 10 course sections in a given term. Or maybe you have. You never know. The reason why some of the data will look a little bit weird is because it's a test account, just so you know. So this is your home page. First thing to always remember is that everything within the page is based on the term you select. If you log in and you're looking for your reports and you don't see them, make sure that you've selected the right term from the drop-down box, because you're going to see your reports based on terms. Today, I'm not going to talk in detail about your faculty reports. That's the actual reading of those reports is not a big focus today. We have lots of resources available to you for those of you who still want help with learning with how to read your reports. But I do want to just point out real quickly how you access your reports. So once an evaluation is closed for a given term, we can see here, this is one of the terms that was taught by Sample Instructor. The results are now available at the View Results button, and you get a page that looks something like this, right? this should be familiar to some of us. You should see something similar to this when you log into your own page. A few things that I just want to point out here. You have a number of reports available to you in these different tabs. The summative reports, that's where you're going to get your progress on relevant objectives score, your summary score, and your ratings of summative questions. Your formative tab, that's where you're going to see all the data on the teaching methods that your students observed. The quantitative tab is just going to be the numbers. Every question, what was my mean score on every question? Qualitative is where you're going to get that comments. And then segment comparison is where you're going to be able to compare your mean scores to other units on campus for each individual question. On your faculty reports page, this is also where you're going to be able to toggle between your raw versus adjusted averages. To remind you, those are impacted by things like how students rate their investment in the class or their preparedness for the class. Those scores will adjust accordingly. This is also where you're going to be able to compare your results to the IDEA database, to your institution, to your individual discipline, for example. You'll be able to see your converted average comparisons, and really, this is where you can look and see your response rate for a given term, how many students were enrolled. Again, we're not really delving into how to read any of this. I just wanted to briefly touch on this is where all of that data is. So going back to our homepage, some additional information. Your course roster. This is something I really encourage faculty to check on throughout the term. This is where you can go in, you can see these are the students enrolled in my class. You can search by name. Sometimes there are mistakes are made in terms of data being imported into the system. A student will enroll, but then they drop, and somehow that doesn't get converted over to the course evaluations tool. This is the list of students who will be asked to fill out a survey for your class. So I encourage you to, throughout the term, just give it a look, make sure it's accurate. If it's not accurate, contact your course administrator or your course evaluations administrator. Something else to bear in mind here is that when you look at your list of courses, you'll be able to see whether or not course evaluations are completed for the individual section. By seeing the view results button, that's one of the ways you'll know, but you'll also be able to see right here, when was it completed, what date, what time. You'll be able to see what the response rate was for that individual section. While the administration is ongoing, bear in mind that number response rate will adjust as you go. So you can monitor response rates as the administration is open. And of course, you can see there as well how many students are enrolled in the section. Forgive the blurriness of this screen. It had to do with how I was able to put the data together and what I was working with. What I want to point out here is at the top there, you can see an example of a course section where administrations are completed and you're able to view results. Next section that we've got here, what we can see is that this is a section that is currently being evaluated. Students are currently able to go in and fill out their survey. And what you see here is this view evaluation link. I don't know how many of you are already using it, but this is something I strongly urge you to get familiar with. If you click on that link, you're going to get this box that's going to open that's going to include a direct evaluation link for that specific course section. So this is particularly useful if you want to find a way to either do course evaluations in class or during a virtual lecture. You can email this to your students. You can post it on your course management system. When students go to that link, it will take them exclusively to the course evaluation for this specific section. This link will only work for a student who's enrolled in your class. So if they share it with their roommate and their roommate tries to do a course evaluation for your class because they're a rascal, it won't work. It will only work for a student who's actually enrolled in the class. So getting at this bigger conversation of how do we stay with our students? How do we use these features to improve teaching and learning in the classroom? Well, why should we use that direct evaluation link? Well, we have found in our research that the number one thing that raises response rates is in-class capture. Actually taking time during class to hold evaluations raises response rates. For one, you've got a captive audience. For two, it signals to students that you understand their time, you understand they're busy. If they can just take care of this during class, they're much more likely to complete it than if it's an additional chore that they have to complete outside of class. Now, that said, for those of us who are holding, virtual lectures or asynchronous classes, or not having in-person classes at all, think creatively about whether or not this is something that you can do in a virtual lecture. Tell your students, I'm going to turn off Zoom for 5 minutes while you do the course evaluation, and then I'll be back. It is possible that you'll have less success with this in a virtual environment, but one of the things we really emphasize here is talking to your students about this process. And the more you talk to them about it, the more likely they are to take it serious and actually do it. And the direct evaluation link is one way to get that done. Now, on that note, when we talk about how do we stay connected with our students, how do we get those high response rates? How do we get data that we actually find useful? The name of the game is to actually communicate with our students. If in-class capture is the number one way to raise response rates, the number two way to raise response rates is to actually talk to your students about why course evaluations matter, how you use the data that you're gathering, and how you've used it. We live in an age of rate my professor, right? So many students think about course evaluations the way we think about Yelp reviews. This is where we go and we say, this was a great teacher, or this is a terrible teacher, never go to their class. And this kind of model of Yelp reviews or rate my professor has for many students and many faculty eroded our understanding of what course evaluations are actually for. Course evaluations is not about rating my professor. Course evaluations is about reflecting on my own learning and saying, I care about the educational environment that me and my peers are involved in, and I want to be a part of it getting better. When we actually talk to students about why their feedback is valuable and how we use their feedback, we move away from the Yelp model and towards the idea of collaborative learning and collaborative assessment. We teach them that assessment matters and that their stake in the learning environment matters. And so this is really one of the key things I want us to take away from today's discussion. For all of the features that I'm going to show you today, for all of the suggestions that I'm going to make to you today, this is the sort of philosophy that I want you to take away from the conversation. Now, not for nothing, as we go through these additional resources, I'm going to share, things you can do. Try this, try that, try the other thing. I want to be very clear with you that I know how busy you are. Under no circumstances do I expect that you will do all of these things. I'm not giving you a laundry list of potential activities because I think you've just got tons of time on your hand and would love to commit 40% of class time to course evaluations. No, that's not the goal. What I am hoping, however, is that as I give these various examples, something will stick with you. There'll be some idea that you'll think, I'm going to try that and see how it goes and use that as a way to stay connected with my students. So if you find one thing to try from today's discussion, I hope that what the philosophy will drive that experiment is that, hey, if I talk to about why course evaluations matter, they will understand why it matters. They will be more likely to respond, and the feedback that they give will be more substantive than a Yelp review or rate my professor. Okay, So that said, let's head back to our home page. Next thing I want to talk to you about is this feature, which is course evaluations questions. Out of curiosity, raise your Microsoft Teams hand if you have ever added faculty questions to a course evaluation. Okay. Great. Awesome. So I'm seeing some hands raised. That's fantastic. For those of you who have not used this feature before or are not even familiar with this feature, it's very simple. When you go to that top menu bar and you select course evaluation questions, what you're going to see is the list of course sections that you're teaching in a given term. On the right, you'll see one of two things, either a view evaluation button. What that means is that the evaluation is closed for that term or for that course section, but you can still view the evaluation questions that were asked. Or you're going to see this view edit button, which means that the evaluation has not opened for that particular course section, and you can still add faculty added custom questions. When you click on that button, you're going to be taken to a screen that shows you two things. On the left, and this is true even if the evaluation is closed. On the left, you'll see here are the questions that were asked of my student. This is valuable in case you just want to know what questions your students are being asked in the survey beforehand. But you're also going to see the ability to edit custom questions. You can add custom questions here. It's a really simple interface. You basically have two options. You can add a multiple choice question with single select, or you can add a text box question, which is where students can give comments. I'm not going to lie and tell you that this is the most sophisticated interface that you'll ever work with, but I will tell you that it is simple. And for many of us, that's what matters, right? A couple of things to bear in mind here. You have to add these questions to each individual course section. In other words, if you're teaching 3 sections of Writing 121, you'll have to add the questions to each individual section. They don't transfer over, so be aware of that. 2, lots of people, when they see this feature, they get really excited and they say, yay, I have so many questions that I want to ask, and they end up adding, 5, 10 questions to the survey. I really want to advise you that if you decide to add custom questions, you really only add 2 to 3. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, these questions will be asked of students on top of their other evaluation questions. We know that the more questions we ask students, the more we run into the problem of survey fatigue, where students just give up because there's too many questions. So we don't want to add 10 questions on top of what they're already having to answer. So that's one reason why. The second reason is that whenever we put together questions, as tempting as it can be to say, I want to ask all the things and gather all the data, what we have to remember about data is that it is only as useful and valuable as what we plan to use it for. In other words, we can ask all kinds of questions, but if we have no plan for what we're going to do with the resulting data, then that data is just a bunch of numbers and figures in the air. It's not useful to us. It does nothing for us. If you're going to add custom questions, really think about what data you want to gather and what you want to do with that data next time you teach this class. Now, that said, how do we use this feature of faculty added custom questions to stay connected with your students? I'm going to throw out a few ideas here. Again, if you see something that strikes your fancy, go for it, but don't feel like there's some kind of expectation that you would do all of these things. One thing you can do, consider drafting questions that you intend to ask throughout the term. So one of the things we talked about at the formative feedback session that some of you may have attended earlier today is the value of gathering formative feedback throughout the term. Let's say you decide that you really want to assess your students throughout the term on something like remote communication options. How have virtual office hours been going? Are discussion board events useful to you? How's your experience of the technology? Maybe you draft these questions and you decide, that you want to ask these questions as a discussion activity or a quiz 2 to 3 times in the term. Maybe you're going to use your course management system to do this, or some kind of, or a simple in-class activity to ask these questions. Discuss responses to these questions in class. This is what you're saying about virtual office hours. Here's how I'm going to adjust virtual office hours based on your feedback. Here's what you're saying about the technology. Such application stinks. So you know what? We're going to use this application instead. Have these transparent conversations with students that show them that you're thinking about the learning process for them. And then in your final course evaluation, make these questions custom questions that you add to the evaluation. That way you can actually gather data in your final course evaluations that you can put in context of the formative data that you've gathered throughout the term. This can bring the conversation full circle. It can also allow you to create a narrative about what you did in these peculiar times to stay connected with your students. This is the type of initiative that we can talk about in tenure and promotion packages and teaching statements and things like that. Use the tool to bring that conversation full circle so that you have a data point at the end of it to show where you got to from the beginning versus the end of the term. All right. Moving right along, let's talk about your objective selection form, which many of you have probably spent a lot of time with. I'm just going to go over a few things here. Again, we're largely familiar with this, but it doesn't help to do the occasional refresher. Something I want to point out, in case no one has mentioned it to you recently, and I'll read this aloud because it might be a little bit small for you. So as a general rule, we want you to prioritize what you want to learn by selecting no more than 3 to 5 objectives as important or essential. If you look at these 13 objectives and you select 10 of them as essential, your reports aren't going to give you as nuanced information as if you really hone in on 3 to 5 specific learning objectives. Not only does it aid your reports, the actual intellectual labor of honing in and focusing and saying, these are the most important learning objectives for my class, is a great class preparation activity. It really helps you to see not just the things that you want students to learn, but maybe the things that your particular course section really is obligated to teach them. It can help you think about how you design lectures and activities to actually achieve these learning objectives. You'll be able to see how many learning objectives you've selected right here. So if you see that you've got 6, 7, that's a signal to you that, okay, I need to hone in. I really need to focus on what the best and most important learning objectives are for my class. As you start to make selections by, selecting those radial buttons, remember to click save. Lots of people, they forget to do this, and then they get these reports back that are kind of bogus. That's because if you don't make selections, every one of these selections will default to important, which, as you can imagine, can adversely impact your reports, right? You don't want that to happen. So this is not the reason why it's so important for you to fill out the objective selection form, but also, just make sure that you click that save button so that you can be sure that your reports will actually reflect the objectives that you wanted your students to achieve this term. Now, many of you are familiar with the objective selection form. Each individual course section will have a little button that says fill out the objective selection form, but we're eventually going to be phasing out the individual selection form and replacing it with something called the Objective Selection Form Manager, which is already available to you in the top menu bar. If you haven't used this yet, I encourage you to get familiar with it. It's a really useful feature that I want to talk through with you right now. So whereas the objective selection form is going to list out every objective. It's going to be just for that individual course section. It's going to have those radial buttons. The objective selection form manager is much more succinct. When you go to this page, you're going to see every term, results for every term. You'll be able to drop down each of those menus to see the objective selections that you made, every course section that you taught in every term. Now, if you zoom in on this, you might look at that and be like, well, gosh, I don't remember what objective selection or objective number 3 is. That's okay. You click on that button and you're going to see the actual objective appear. The I, M, and E's there that you see there, they stand for important, minor, and essential. So even though the data is streamlined here and the information is concise here, you can still get all of the information that you need by clicking on these different buttons. Now, in addition to the benefit of putting everything right there on one page, so you don't have to click on a button for each individual section. You can do it all in one window. In addition to the benefits of that, you have the ability to actually compare individual section responses to past sections. So let's say I know that this fall I'm going to be teaching Accounting 249. And I know that I taught it back in fall 2018, but that was a different world. I have no idea what selections I made, but I'd be curious to look at what I did in the past. So first off, choose which year you want to compare to. I know that I taught that course section in fall 2018 as well. So I'm going to select that term and then look at Accounting 249 section 1 again, because I'm teaching the same thing this fall. When I make that selection, what I'm going to see here is it's going to single out what the selections were when I taught this course in 2018. I can say, hey, for objective 1, I said that this was important. This term, I've got this set to minor. Now, do I want to leave it at minor, or based on how things in fall 2018, do I want to raise it to important? Do I maybe want to raise it to essential? The value of this comparison is that it's an easy way to see what things look like in the past, and to basically check your work. Lots of faculty, what they use this for is they know I teach the same course term after term. I want to be able to just quickly go in and see what objectives I selected last term, plug them in real quick and move on. This makes it really easy for you to do that. So I think the Objective Selection Form Manager has a great interface. It's really useful. Eventually, this is what you're going to use for all your objective selections. That individual form is going to be phased out. So it's worthwhile for you to spend some time familiarizing yourself with the Objective Selection Manager. And, I encourage you to periodically review the objectives. Think about the objective selection process. This is so important to your reports, but it's also one of the most important pieces of what I want to talk about in how you can use this tool to stay connected with students. Most of us, we fill out that objective selection form because it's something we have to do for our course evaluations reports, right? It's a task on the list. Some of us actually really do engage in the intellectual work of thinking deeply about those selections, and how it can actually influence course design. It's variable depending on the individual faculty member. But almost none of us actually talk to our students about this process of selections. And I would like to suggest to you that there is a huge value in walking your students through this process with you. For one, it's a way to show them how intentional you are about their learning. To say to them, these are the particular objectives that I want you to learn in my class. Here's how I am indicating their significance here. Have a conversation with your students about those selections. Ask them, which of these objectives would you assume would be most important based on what you know about this course? Make it a transparent conversation. This is also a great opportunity early in the course to signal to students why course evaluations are important. So often we only talk to our students about course evaluations at the end of the term when we're making the plug, please do your course evaluations. But if we start to have this conversation early in the term, we say to them, these are the things that we want you to learn. Then when it comes time for them to actually fill out their course evaluations, they're already familiar with this conversation. They've already been taught to think about it. They've already been taught that it's important. And so the feedback they give is going to be informed by those conversations and going to be more substantive. Another thing that you can do as you think about how to use your objective selection process in the classroom, be transparent with students about the relationship between classroom activities and selected learning objectives. Whether that's a lecture that you're giving, an assignment, a group activity, preface these activities with a reassertion of what objectives are at play. For today's lecture, we're going to be talking about X. The specific learning objectives that we're focusing on here are Y. These are the things we want you to think about throughout your learning. And then you can actually check in with students and ask them, how are you feeling about that learning objective? This was the goal. We wanted you to come away having practiced this. Do you feel like you actually got there? Again, in times when there's so much anxiety about the changed learning environment and are we getting the teaching that we want, are we learning the things we want to, the more transparent you can be with your students about the learning process, the more confidence you will give them that, hey, things may have changed, but you're still learning. Here's the proof that you're learning. Now, along those same lines, one of the things that can be really valuable to talk to students about is how these actual objectives are mapping on to their career goals and their job skills. Some of us are going to be more comfortable doing this than others, right? Some of us are going to say, you know, hey, this isn't, I'm not really focusing with my students on talking about their particular job skills. I have other goals in class. Some of us, this is really going to be our jam. We're going to say, yeah, I want my students to come away from my classroom clearly able to articulate how these skills will have better equipped them for their career. If you're talking to your students about how individual objectives map onto job skills, remember that they can create a narrative out of those objectives. They can map that narrative onto a job interview, onto a resume, onto a professional activity. If you're teaching that intro to writing class and an important objective that you're focusing on is writing and communication skills, talk to your students about how their ability to demonstrate their writing and communication skills will help them get a job in bioengineering, will help them to get a job in advertising. Talk to them about how they can narrativize their experience of X assignment when they have a job or internship interview at the organization of their dreams. This is, again, just another way that we can really engage our students in the value of assessing their own learning and thinking about why what they're learning is valuable and why how they're learning it is important. As we start to wind down, there are some major takeaways that I want us to focus on from today's training. One, talk to your students about the purpose of assessment, whether it's your course evaluation or formative assessment that's happening throughout the term. Talk to them about it. Talk to them about the learning objectives you've selected and what they mean for their learning and for their experience of the classroom. Gather formative feedback from students that you can view in the context with your summative course evaluations data. Remember that teaching has not gotten worse because of COVID-19, and learning has not actually decreased. Things have changed, things are chaotic. Some of us are having good days and bad days, successes and failures, but overall, the mission of learning and teaching is still succeeding. And remember that the strategies that we've talked about today, they're useful now, but they will also be useful in 3 years. Will also be things that you can do when things are quote unquote back to normal. All of these strategies are useful, regardless of the individual teaching method that we're using. So those are some basic takeaways. And we've talked about a lot of things right now. We've got about 15 minutes. What I'd really like to do now is open up the conversation to you. I've been talking to you about how to stay connected with your students by using this specific tool. I want you to have the opportunity to, one, ask me questions about the tool if you have them, but also to raise questions to each other or give examples to each other of strategies that you have been using to stay connected with your students. One of the impacts of COVID-19 is that we're not seeing each other the way that we used to. Many of us feel isolated from our peers in teaching. If this is an opportunity for us to actually exchange ideas, I'd really love for us to take it. So whether you want to throw a comment into the chat function or raise your hand and unmute yourself, I'd love to hear either your thoughts or questions right now. Put another way, are there any strategies that or ideas that I've talked about today that sound of interest or that maybe you're already engaging in?
I think there's some questions in the chat.
Oh gosh, I couldn't even see any chat questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, who's this?
This is Chris Warren.
Hi, Chris.
I wanted to say that something that you said that I had never thought of doing before that I think would be really effective was to talk about the actual objective in terms of what it means for them, and not just like, this is what I'm trying to do, but this is what I'm trying to do, and this is what will help you, and kind of hammer that point home. I think that's good. That's definitely something I'm going to try to use this round of
awesome.
Of course evaluations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Value that feedback so much. I apologize, everyone. For some reason, normally in the chat function, I get a little notification, but I didn't have any notifications. So let me look at what the questions were. So I see that Julie asked, is there a way to do across-class reports for course evaluation results for program reviews? So, Julie, if you wanna talk a little bit more about what you mean there, certainly one of the things that is happening is that your administrators have access to additional reports that they're using to do this kinds of program review. If you're talking about individually, if there's a way for you as a faculty member to do across-class reports for course evaluation, there's not currently a way to say, here's the exact same scores that I got in this class versus this class. However, you do have something called the Trends Analysis Report, which is available to you. And in fact, let me scroll back to one of my. Okay, so if you see up here, this little button that says Trends Analysis, when you folks log into that, because you haven't been using our system that long, you won't have much data there yet. But what this does is it allows you to see how you scored on a specific question for every course section across time. And that's a really useful tool to give attention to, especially because we encourage our faculty to focus on outliers and more on trends. So you can actually see your trends for individual questions like, a specific question like the objective of teaching your students about diversity, let's say. And let's say you wanted to see how you were trending on that specific question over time. You'd be able to use the trends analysis to do that. I hope that got a little bit at your question, Julie. Let me know if it didn't. And I see, Kenna, that was your question as well.
Well, my just to provide some context, we're going through an accreditation process for our MPH.
Right.
And so I thought if we all in each course maybe asked a similar additional question, that would be interesting to see how we're doing as a program versus just as an individual course.
Yeah. So what I would say is talk to your department chair and your dean, because they have reports available to them that allow them to see how your unit is actually doing. Those reports aren't available to you because they would give away information about other faculty members, and that would be, a problem. But yes, your chairs and your deans do have access to that kind of analysis. And I actually just got out of a session where I was urging them to share that data with their faculty. So I would encourage you, go to your deans, go to your chairs, and ask them to share that data with you. Kenna has asked, or do analysis of the same courses over different years that shows improvement, decrease in student learning. Again, that's something that you can assess your growth, your individual growth on a course through trends analysis. And that's also something that your department chairs and course admin have additional resources available to them to do that. I urge you to partner with your leadership if you want to do that kind of programmatic assessment. Melanie says, will campus labs eventually have access to older evaluations? So I'm very sorry to say, Melanie, that the course evaluations data from that you had previously, there's no way for that data to be added to our system. I recognize that is a huge drag. But right now, with the way that the tool is built, there's just literally no functional way for us to put the data from past course evaluations into our system. It can only gather data moving forward. Allison asks, I know that you talked about the formative tool. Any chance you might be opening this to also include some sort of assessment related to the objectives? I do some of this in my own courses related to knowledge and beliefs, but it would be neat to show growth on objectives specifically. I completely agree with you on that, Allison. Some campuses, what they have done is they've essentially used the tool to do a kind of midterm evaluation. The logistics of that are a little complicated. If that's something that you're really interested in, again, that's something I would urge you to talk to your chair about the logistics of that. Right now, there's not a simple way in the tool to perform that kind of analysis. I have a lot of faculty and campuses who get creative with it by using discussion boards or creating their own surveys, or using other tools to kind of gather that feedback over time. Right now, unfortunately, there's not an easy way to do that, but we could work through something if we got significant interest from the campus. Leanne asks, why do students have to complete all 13 objectives when we only identify 3 for our course? So the reason for that is in many ways it's technical. It's to ease their experience of the tool. And also we gain information from how they rate the objectives that are not as significant to them. So you're still going to get data. You're still going to learn from them how they feel they achieved a specific objective. Now, for some of us, it might feel like, well, that data is not useful to me. But I have had faculty members who have been really surprised to find, hey, this was an objective that I rated as minor. And then all of my students said that they really grew in this objective. What is that telling me about my teaching? What is that telling me about my students' learning? And so really it's just because we all of those objectives are important to learning, and the data that we gather from those objectives are useful, even if there's only 3 that we are particularly identifying for our course. Okay, moving down. Leanne also asked, students often select the same number for every objective, even if it was never covered in class. That's not useful. You're absolutely correct. That is not useful. We are always going to get students whose response to the course evaluation surveys is going to be surface level. What I've been talking about today is really one of the ways we could talk about it is building a culture of assessment. By which we mean building a culture in our classroom where students actually value assessment and value the process of assessing their own learning and what helped them learn. And so when we have these conversations, when we engage students in the process, when we're transparent with students about the process, not only do our response rates go up, but the substance of the feedback that we get is higher. So, something that I like to say when people come to me and they say, I really want to raise my response rates. So I'm going to give a pizza party to everybody who fills out their course evaluations. It's like, that's great. Incentives for raising response rates, totally value them. But why do we care about having high response rates? Well, we care about it because we believe that the more data we get, the more reliable data it is. And that is true to an extent, but not if we're gathering data that reflects no data literacy. If we're actually transparent with students and we teach students what these course evaluations mean, not only are they more likely to respond, but what they actually say, they're less likely to give that straight, 4s all the way down. They're much more likely to give us data that means something. And so that's part of why this conversation has focused on raising response rates and more on connecting with your students about assessment culture, because that will impact the other and will additionally just more valuable information in the long run. I seem to be caught up on the comments. If I missed anyone, please holler at me or put your comment. And again, we've got a couple minutes left. Does anybody have? You're welcome, Leanne. Does anybody have any additional comments or questions or feedback? Okay, well, nobody hates getting 5 minutes back on their day, so I'm going to go ahead. Melanie just said, speaking of extra credit, here's the website for adding points on Canvas for filling out the idea survey. Excellent, thanks for sharing that, Melanie. There are additional resources available to you on our support site, particularly on raising response rates. Remember that our support resources are available to you if you have questions about how to access them. Speak to your course evaluations administrator. I really want to thank you for your participation in today's meeting. It's been a pleasure talking to you all. I hope that you found something useful, and I hope that I get to speak to you folks again someday, perhaps in person, rather than virtually. Thank you all so much. This recording will be made available to you, just so you know, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your afternoon. Take care, and bye-bye.